Hello, everyone, and we'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. The time is now 3:59. We will get started promptly at 4 p.m., just allowing you enough time to get in and get settled. We have a very exciting topic for you today, and we'll hope you enjoy it. Stay engaged with each other, as well as placing questions in the Q&A chat box if you have them. Please feel free to pull up a chair, and stay engaged. We're going to get started promptly at 4 p.m. Thank you once again for joining Cal today for our Research to Policy webinar. All right, and so let's get started. The time is now 4 p.m. And welcome. My name is Althea. And thank you for joining us for this 30-minute webinar in our Research to Policy Critical Conversations in Language Education series. This year's theme is Let's Be Real about literacy development for multilingual learners. We will focus on addressing the real-world challenges and opportunities in supporting literacy development for multilingual learners. Through dynamic discussions with leading voices in the field, we will explore innovative strategies, research-centered approaches, and practical policy insights to enhance literacy outcomes for diverse multilingual learners. Today's webinar is supporting dialect and vernacular language speakers in the literacy classroom, and we will be speaking with Shauna K. Tucker. I am joined by David Cassels-Johnson and Kira Ballantyne. We are recording this webinar and will post the recording on our website after the event. Before we begin, please mute your microphones to avoid interruptions. You can activate closed captioning by pressing the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. This event is provided as a public service. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed below solely belong to the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of our organization. Our panel comprises esteemed experts who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in language education, language access, and equity. You can learn more about them on the webinar's webpage. We will share the link in the chat. We do encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box throughout the call. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of our discussion. It is, in fact, an excellent opportunity to tap into the wealth of knowledge we are fortunate to have here today. Also, please click the chat button at the bottom of your screen to share your thoughts and comments anytime. Try that now by letting us know where you're listening from. And with that, I will now pass the microphone to our facilitators.
Thank you very much, Althea. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Shauna K. Tucker, who is an assistant professor of applied linguistics at OISE University of Toronto. Her research focuses on the language and literacy development of learners with English as an additional language with a particular emphasis on writing. As a Caribbean native, she carries out extensive work with children who speak dialects, vernaculars, and Creole languages, exploring how schools can best support English literacy development through evidence-based practices that validate learners' linguistic resources.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tucker. I get to ask the first question. So first of all, could you please tell us about the language practices of students who speak what are sometimes referred to as dialect or vernacular language varieties? Are there any misconceptions that you come across?
Thank you, David, and thank you for having me, everyone. It's really exciting to be able to talk to an audience like this about this group that's often overlooked in research and in practice at times. And so I think the best thing to do is lay the groundwork of the actual students that we're talking about here. And so when we talk about dialects or vernacular languages and creoles, we're largely talking about primarily oral languages. So these languages, in most cases, do not have a standardized orthography, and they're most times spoken in the home and not sanctioned by education systems. So in the case of your context in the US, this is most popularly seen among speakers of, for example, African American Vernacular English, AAVE, if I refer to it that way later on. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with. And so it's quite a unique positioning for these learners compared to, say, a more typical ESL learner in schools, because these have a more of a peculiar relationship to the standardized language of literacy in the schools. And for many of these students, English is really neither a first language, for example, or a foreign language because of the context that they're living in. And so what we find often is that the vocabulary, the structure of the language is that the vocabulary or the lexicon is largely shared. So shared with, say, in this case, English, if it's an English Creole or dialect. But the grammar and the phonology of the language differ significantly, which make them a separate linguistic variety or linguistic entity in that case. And so you get to have these blurred boundaries that on the surface, the languages look quite similar because the vocabulary is very similar. But where we have some challenges is where the blurred boundaries kind of hide that there is a systematic difference happening in the grammar of the languages. And we often see this manifest in the productive skills that children do in school. So the productive skills being speaking and writing, where you see phonology having an effect, or you might see evidence of this in students writing. The other complication here is that because these students have high receptive language skills, so comprehension skills, because of the shared nature of the languages, it's often overlooked that there are some structural differences that might need pedagogical attention. So they tend to be overlooked and they tend to continue as long as they're overlooked. And so we'll look further on about the specifics, but that's just to emphasize that these are separate linguistic entities, but that they're language varieties in their own right. They are not less than. That's really important for us to underline here. They're not less than, they're just different, variation. And so in the context of the US, this is often looked at as African Vernacular American English, but in countries like this in the global north, where there's high levels of immigration, you also in your classrooms and in your schools have lots of students who speak similar varieties like Creole languages spoken in, say, for example, West Africa or the Caribbean. And also in countries like Greece and Singapore and Australia, Creoles are widely spoken. And so we have quite a range in our classrooms that we owe it to serve in terms of literacy. And to your second, I just remembered your second question, David, linking to that about the misconceptions. I would say the main misconception would be that these are not systematic, rule-governed language varieties that these children are speaking. The second one is in general belief, in public discourse, there is the belief that these languages, these dialects or vernaculars that children speak, will hinder their language and literacy development. And so they should be kept out of the classroom at all costs. And that's in the countries in which these languages originate. I do a lot of work in the Caribbean, for example, and that's often the belief. But also here in the global north, we have a similar thing, because we believe it's the main source of any language or literacy challenges that these students will encounter. And slightly related, it's that not all students are dominant speakers of these languages, which I think is very important for teachers to keep in mind. I've read a lot of studies where it's assumed based on where students live, if they live in for example, a community with a high Black population, that these students are dominant speakers. I think it's really important to keep in mind that they may or may not be. And so we do need to be careful. And when we take these things into consideration and tailor our approaches by getting to know our students a bit more, as this could also be a bit harmful. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you so much for those very important reminders of the strong linguistic repertoires that students bring to school, and also for that reminder to get to know your students as individuals, because you can't tell what languages people speak by looking at them. People have varieties, and often many, many varieties that they can draw on. So I'd like to drill down a little bit and think a little bit more about literacy. Can you tell us from your research what you've learned about literacy practices that work for speakers of these dialects, these vernacular versions of English?
Mm-hmm. And so I'll just preface it with saying that a lot of my writing and my research is on writing specifically. I do a bit on reading, but what a lot of the things I'll say are tied to writing, also because you see more effects there. And so I think the first thing to say before mentioning the pedagogical approach is that I did a recent study where I surveyed all Creole's dialects across globally to see what the patterns were. And it challenged the prevailing narrative that the home language, these oral languages, are the main source of errors in student writing. We did find that they were common. They're not uncommon. It's not uncommon to see influence from these languages in English writing, for example. But we also found that it was neither the only or predominant source of errors or challenges that students encountered, which leads to the implication that when we're thinking of supporting dialect or Creole or vernacular speakers, we need to take a broader view somewhat in terms of supporting them. And so what we do know is that for most of the research on interventions comes from the US among AAVE speakers and carried out by speech pathologists for various reasons. But what we found is that for the US in general, like specifically, we see that there are developmental patterns. So this means that you do see more influence of the dialects when children are younger. And by time children get to about grade 3, we see a dialect shift where they are able to separate their spoken language from the domain of writing. So they understand the requirements and what is expected. So that's important to keep in mind that children will, for dialect specifically, we don't see it as much with Creoles, but children will experience a shift as they go through schooling. So there is that for patience and just knowing developmentally when a child is ready for more targeted support. And we've seen where there is an influence, it's mostly in grammar, specifically morphosyntax, the verb phrase specifically. So tense, for example, in dialects and Creoles is not marked. So I might say, I went to the supermarket yesterday. If I was writing an English sentence for a teacher, but a dialect speaker, it's completely fine to not use went. You could just use go, the unmarked verb. So these are where we start to see the influence. And so in terms of pedagogical support, what we've seen work, and it comes largely out of the US, is where teachers provide explicit instruction in language awareness. So it might sound big, but really what it is a teacher taking the time to explicitly help students to realize these are two separate varieties, both valid, but these are where the clear differences are. So in English, for example, it's important to mark tense. But in your home language, the dialect, whatever it is, the Creole that you speak, that might not be the case. So in that way, acknowledging these are two valid systems, but we've found that when students get explicit instruction, not just saying this is the case in English, but this is the case in English, this is not the case in your home language variety, children tend to have better outcomes because one, they don't feel disregarded in the classroom and they feel confident that, oh, what they speak at home is worth something. But also they can see the differences. So that's what we've found has worked the most. We've also seen in Hawaiian schools an approach where they use culturally sensitive talk. So a lot of these languages, I said, they're oral languages, and the cultures rely a lot on oral storytelling, not necessarily written stories, to transmit culture. And so we've found in interventions in Hawaii specifically and Australia, where teachers use the concept of talk story. So before children even write, they have a time to just talk and throw out their ideas whichever language they want to use to get the ideas building and have children comfortable. And then when we have children go to write, we see better outcomes where they were able to build their ideas without being shut down, or to maybe write the first draft without being really too mindful about accuracy and complexity and whether they need to pull on a vocabulary item from their home language. But also, if you need to assess it in English, which is understandable given the context, maybe in the final draft, we can move towards that. So there are ways to embed the oral practices, the ways that these children are used to seeing, to telling stories, for example. There are a few programs in the US, like the MELD programs, that the English language development programs, that use these approaches and have seen strong results. So that might be, I think they've used a combination of explicit plus building in the cultural awareness practices at the same time. And then the last thing I'll say is that we've found when teachers establish varied goals for writing, for example. So some of the one goal might be accuracy, complexity, but establishing other times when students can write and that is not the outcome measure is another way to encourage students, because what we see is a lot of linguistic insecurity where children are afraid to be wrong or to be laughed at. So we find that they write really short compositions, which some of you may have seen if you're a teacher where a child might write one line or rely on very simple vocabulary out of fear of being wrong because the goal is correctness. So maybe varying those, because we do see among these children, a little research has suggested positive transfer. A lot of the research focuses on the negative effects, but we do see a few studies where these children, when allowed to write for varied goals, they do take more risks than many of their peers, often incorporating idioms and when they're not so focused on accuracy all the time. So that's something that we've seen, that there is space for positive transfer, but the atmosphere has to be set for children to feel quite safe to do so.
Thank you. I have the next question. So, given what you've just said about sort of the language acquisition processes, pedagogical implications, and practices to accommodate those processes, what do you think about policy priorities for literacy development in particular? How can we leverage the information you just talked about to develop policies for these students? And I mean, I think about policies too at multiple levels. So it could be a school district administrator, it doesn't have to be
Yeah.
someone at the federal level, could be that too. But
Yeah.
thinking about the multi-level nature of policy making, like how do we use this information
Right.
to sculpt our policies?
So I think I often take it when I'm thinking of policy from the SGD, the development goals for 2030, where goal 4.6 says that all children attain literacy. And so if we're taking it from that position, it is that we do whatever we can to ensure that our diverse populations can. So more specifically, when it comes, teacher training is a big one. I find I'm always quite careful when I speak about teachers because it's very different to be a researcher in your office away from the realities of the classroom to say what teachers should do. But I think teachers should be, in the first place, equipped with these skills. It should be a part embedded within teacher training programs that teachers are aware of these varieties, and especially for contexts where there are high populations of students who might speak diverse languages and dialects as well, that this is built into teachers training, this language awareness component, so that teachers can feel confident in addressing these things, that they would feel like they have the toolkit, the language to even use with these students. That's quite important from a higher level. But related to teachers is a lot of teachers are doing a lot of good work, is what we saw. A lot of the research that I've found is teachers doing action research, teachers trying out their own practices, doing their own readings, trying out practices in Hawaii especially. And so I think it's quite important for policy to always be bringing teachers into the conversation to see, okay, what's being done and how can we build these out into bigger frameworks that can be tested out, which leads to the next one at a policy level for supporting research. And that can be big research, expensive research, but it also can be very small, local level research, maybe within a district, or within a school even, where teachers try out these, based on research, try out these different approaches and see how it works for their students. So I think having a research orientation to this population as well, since we tend to have this orientation already for general ESL programming, for example, but to not leave this group out of that, I did a systematic review, and of all the studies that we could find, it was just 22, maybe 7 from the US, which that was the largest group, but that tells you the small amount of research. And among that, maybe 5 were intervention studies. So we don't know much about what works. And so I think there is the space to support that type of work and to support schools and school districts in that work. And just the continued awareness at the level of policy. I think all of these things trickle down from larger societal ideology and policies. A lot of teachers complain that, well, if the school policy doesn't bring this in, I can't make a significant change. So a lot of it is from a policy perspective of acknowledging the diverse linguistic varieties that are part of the classroom and promoting equitable ways and promoting positive and equitable language around that to bring everyone on the same page. So I think those are 4 or 5, maybe 4 things that we could start with to start making some changes. And I will say, I know that the US is a big country, and so it differs from state to state, and it's quite different, but it's where we've seen the most progress. So there's always hope. I think to end on a hopeful note, that there is movement compared to other contexts where we see work is being done, but we need to kind of expand that.
I think remembering that there is always hope is a great way to think about the kinds of changes that we want to see. We have some really great questions from the chat, and so I probably don't think we'll get to all of them, but I do want to pull out a couple. So the first one is somebody, Margaret, who has heard what you had said earlier in the session about speech pathologists being a particular source. And so what she says is she's concerned hearing that intervention is commonly provided by speech pathologists. And what is this sort of pathology-based approach? Might that
Absolutely,
affect
Margaret.
attitudes towards the learners? Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for asking. I was trying to get everything in, so I couldn't dive in, but that was really interesting to me to note that most of the US research was not in, say, linguistics or education, that it was coming from speech pathology, which I appreciate speech pathologists doing the work, but that's what struck me, that it does then give this deficit almost perspective that it's likely that these children are being sent to speech pathology because of their language, when they don't necessarily have a linguistic deficit. It's just a linguistic variation. So I totally agree. I think the fact that most of the interventions are coming from SLP does shout at me as problematic, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was not the case in other contexts. That comes from more
Interesting.
language and literacy research.
I agree. I mean, I think when the goal, which is the goal in speech pathology, which is to find and diagnose and solve problems. If your goal is to find problems, you're going to find problems,
Yeah.
and it's not a problem.
Yeah.
So it's not a deficit. But speaking of deficits, I think I want to combine, if I can. We're getting a lot of great questions, but maybe and I see something in the chat as well. And if I could, I'm going to ask you an impossible question, because if I could answer this, if we could answer this, we'd all be,
everything.
I mean, we'd have solutions ready to go.
Yeah.
So how can teachers or parents, for that matter, sort of challenge some of this deficit thinking? So someone mentioned not telegraphing a deficit lens, so that the students, the kids, understand that it's okay to use their language varieties in school
Mm.
and perhaps society or wherever?
Yeah, that's a really good question. From what I've seen, and this is quite the same, it should be seen at the same level as ESL and any other multilingual setting where a lot of it comes from children internalize the narratives that they've heard over time. And so what we've seen is classrooms where teachers talk about the language like any other linguistic variety, first acknowledging in the first place that this is a valid linguistic variety with a rich culture attached to it. When you start from that position and then you say, this is how it differs from English. This is how you may say it in this setting, and this is how it's said in English. That in itself affirms that this is an entity, nothing bad about it, very rich culture, very rich idiomatic expressions. And this is how it's different from what we might see in, say, the exams. And so that's one of the things in making varied assessments where you encourage students to maybe teach students how they can incorporate it, whether you want to use quotations or have one of your characters in your story speak in this language and to switch between. But I think the main thing is acknowledging that they're separate things and that it can be used in our writing to enrich it and that kind of thing. And I think the same for parents in celebrating it as, but acknowledging that this is, let's say, African American vernacular English, and it represents our culture, and but it's different from this language, which is absolutely fine. So I think it's more of the narratives that we have, and the earlier children hear these narratives, the better.
A follow-up to that, and I think very related to the questions that David was synthesizing, thinking specifically about families who perhaps were themselves raised with these deficit narratives
Yeah.
and who come to school situations with a very strong desire to ensure students have success in the dominant language,
Yes,
because that's what you need
absolutely.
for success in the
Absolutely.
world of work. And so have you seen useful ways of brokering those conversations and ensuring that families are both respected in their desires for the kids, but also, you know, having some of those misconceptions addressed head on?
Yeah, that is probably the trickiest bit to this. And I think the US is probably the most known for this, where they had what they called the Ebonics controversy, where even many Black families were offended because they felt that their children in learning AAVE would be held back. And a lot of that really boiled down to a misunderstanding on many parts that was never the goal. So I think the first thing is for having these discussions, coming from the Caribbean, it's very similar, where you have to be really careful with parents. That I think making parents know from the outset that I share your goal, I understand where you're coming from, and this is exactly why we're doing this. I am not, in this case, some researchers do push for, say, the making official languages or teaching it, which is valid in its own right. But what my work is since we are still being assessed in English, since that is the case as of today, we do need to support these learners to get there. And what research says is that all we're doing is helping them to distinguish between the two. We're not saying only speak this language. And I think if parents can understand that clearly, and if it's said respectfully from the get-go, they're a lot more comfortable if they know that you are not trying to hold their child back by saying, I'm going to just let them use AAVE or Jamaican Creole and everyone else can use English. If parents understand the motive and that this is a structured way that we're doing this so that we can support English language development, I feel that's the best and most respectful way. But also to my point, that not assuming that all these children speak these languages. That's a big issue with when you're dealing with parents. So just keeping that in mind, but having very straightforward, honest conversations where parents can understand your goals. That it is ultimately so that you can have strong English literacy on whatever assessment it is.
Okay. Do we have time for one more, Althea, or are we slip one more quick question in, do you think?
Yes, we can slip a quick one in.
This one is about environmental print as being a common practice for multilingual learners to have word walls, to have, translations on your walls. Is there something that is parallel that is a useful environmental practice in classrooms? As you say, these are often not written versions of languages. So
that's where it's quite tricky. The resources, which was one of the implications from our work, that we need to build greater banks of these, especially for well-established languages like, say, Hawaiian Creole or Pidgin English or AAVE Creoles. Some of them do have written orthographies, a lot of Creoles, for example. So there is work that can be done, and the mapping between the languages is quite one-to-one, clearer than English, quite transparent. So that can be done, but a lot of it, unfortunately, the work is put on the people on the ground. It is put on the teachers to find ways to help students. And the other thing is that it might not be, for, say, dialect speakers, having it on the wall, like translations and that kind of thing, might not be what works best. And I think to keep in mind that many of these children are not used to seeing this language written. So that might not, it might be for an ESL context, but they're not used to seeing it written. What they are used to is oral conversations. They're used to hearing it. And that might be the better way as a start, as we build towards building out resources, and to not put too much burden on teachers, but to have children share their stories and to share using their home language, which, because of the shared vocabulary, is largely, in the case of US dialects, it's largely intelligible for the most part. So there might be other ways, and I think it's having a wider understanding that it will not map one-to-one in the ways that we might do for other languages, like vocabulary lists. So it's more drawing on the ways, their funds of knowledge that they already are used to expressing themselves in, rather than trying to pin it to posters that they're not used to seeing it written.
Well, I think thank you so much for answering these questions. This was amazing, very engaging. I see our audience members were very engaged. Thank you so much for joining us today. A big thank you to our speaker today, Shauna K. Tucker. We're grateful to have you. Thank you so much to our awesome facilitators. Thank you to our audience for being here. We will see you at the next one. Please watch your emails for the recording. Have a great day, everyone.